My husband told me I was worthless after I gave birth to my fourth daughter. He said I was broken, that God had cursed me for some sin I must have committed. My parents nodded in agreement when he said these things. They had given me to him when I was 16, and in their eyes I belonged to him completely. My body, my future, my children, everything was his to control. I spent 9 years believing them. 9 years thinking that my only purpose was to produce sons, and my only value came from succeeding at that task. I watched my 4 beautiful girls grow up in a house where their father saw them as disappointments and their mother had forgotten how to smile. I became a ghost in my own life, moving through each day like I was already dead. But when I finally gave birth to a son, when Eduardo got exactly what he had demanded for nearly a decade, something unexpected happened. Instead of feeling relief or joy or vindication, I felt rage. Pure, burning rage that started in my chest and spread through my entire body like fire. Because holding my baby boy, looking at his perfect little face, I realized that nothing had actually changed. Eduardo was still the same man. My parents still saw me as property. And my daughters were still growing up in a world that would teach them they were worth less than their brothers. That's when I knew I had to choose. I could stay and let this cycle continue, watch my girls learn to shrink themselves the way I had learned to shrink myself. Or I could do something that no woman in my family had ever done before. I could fight back. My name is Martha Flores. I am 85 years old. And this is the story of how I saved my own life. I grew up in a small village where your worth was measured by how well you followed the rules that had been written long before you were born. The women in my family had always married young, had babies quickly, and never asked questions. My grandmother did it, my mother did it, and they expected me to do the same. When I was 15, my parents started receiving visitors. Men who would sit in our tiny living room, drinking coffee with my father while stealing glances at me. I thought it was strange, but I was still a child in so many ways. I spent my days reading the few books we had and helping my mother with chores. I had dreams of maybe becoming a teacher someday, of seeing what existed beyond our village walls. Eduardo came in the spring of 1957. He was older than the other men, more confident, with money in his pockets and promises on his lips. He brought gifts for my parents and flowers for me. When he smiled, everyone seemed to believe that smile meant something good. But I noticed things others missed. The way his jaw tightened when I spoke without being asked. How his hand gripped my arm just a little too tightly when he helped me down from his truck. The coldness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. My parents saw a successful man who owned land and cattle. They saw security for their daughter and status for their family. When they announced our engagement, I tried to tell them about the fear that lived in my stomach whenever Eduardo was near. But they said I was being silly, that nerves were natural for a young bride. The wedding happened fast. Too fast for me to understand what I was agreeing to. And by the time I realized what kind of man I had married, it was already too late to run. Please leave in the comments where you're watching this old lady from. It warms my heart to know that my voice is reaching far, maybe even places I never had the chance to visit. And if you like my story, please leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents Archives. I was born in 1940, the third of 5 children, and from the time I could walk, I knew I was different from my brothers. Not in ways that should have mattered, but in ways that my parents, Luis and Sofia, made sure I understood would define my entire life. My brothers could run wild through the fields after school, but I had to come straight home to learn how to cook and clean. They could dream about becoming mechanics or farmers or traveling to the city, but when I talked about maybe teaching children to read someday, my mother would shake her head and say that was foolish thinking. Our house was small and crowded, with thin walls that meant everyone heard everything. I learned to read by candlelight under my blanket because my father said books were a waste of time for girls. But I couldn't help myself. Stories took me away from our cramped rooms and endless chores. In books, women could be brave and smart and independent. They could make their own choices and live their own lives. My mother Sophia had married my father when she was 14. She never learned to read properly, never traveled further than the next town over, never had a conversation about anything except recipes and gossip and which families had marriageable sons. She would watch me with my books and sigh like I was sick with something that needed curing. She'd tell me stories about girls who got too educated and ended up alone and bitter, warning me that men didn't want wives who thought they were smarter than their husbands. My father Luis worked the small plot of land we lived on, always worried about money, always talking about finding ways to improve our family's position in the community. He looked at his daughters the way he looked at his cattle, as assets that could be traded when the right opportunity came along. He never said this directly, but I felt it in the way he dismissed our opinions and measured our value by how well we served the men around us. I was 16 when I overheard my parents talking late one night about Eduardo Flores and his interest in finding a wife. They spoke about me like I was a problem they were trying to solve, a burden they were ready to pass along to someone else. I pressed my ear against the wall and listened to them discuss my future like I had no say in it at all. Eduardo first came to our house on a Tuesday in March. I was washing dishes when I heard his truck pull up, the engine louder than anything we were used to in our quiet neighborhood. My mother quickly smoothed her hair and told me to change into my good dress, the blue one with small flowers that she had sewn for church. I didn't understand why until I saw the way my father straightened his shoulders and put on his most respectful voice. Eduardo was taller than most men in our village, with dark hair slicked back and clothes that looked expensive. He shook my father's hand firmly and complimented my mother on her coffee. When he looked at me, I felt like he was evaluating something he might purchase. He asked me simple questions. Did I know how to cook? Could I manage a household? Was I healthy and strong? I answered politely because my parents were watching, but something in his tone made my skin crawl. Over the following weeks, he visited regularly. He would bring small gifts, candy for me, tobacco for my father, fabric for my mother. Everyone in the family began treating these visits like they were special occasions. My mother would spend hours preparing food and my father would put on his best shirt. They acted like Eduardo was doing us a tremendous favor just by sitting in our living room. I tried to tell my mother that something about Eduardo felt wrong. The way he stared at me when he thought others weren't looking. How he would find reasons to touch my hand or stand too close when we walked. But she brushed away my concerns like they were silly childish fears. She said I was lucky that such a successful man had taken interest in me, that girls my age didn't get many opportunities like this one. My father made the decision without asking what I wanted. He announced one evening that Eduardo had asked for my hand and that he had given his blessing. The wedding would happen in 2 months, enough time to prepare but not enough time for anyone to change their minds. When I tried to object, my father told me this was my chance to bring honor to our family. My mother said it was time for me to stop being selfish and start thinking about my duties as a daughter. The wedding day arrived whether I was ready or not. I stood at the altar in a white dress that felt like a costume, promising to love and obey a man I barely knew. Eduardo smiled throughout the ceremony, charming everyone who watched. But when he squeezed my hand during our vows, his grip was so tight it left marks on my fingers. That should have been my first real warning about what kind of husband he planned to be. The mask came off 3 weeks after our wedding. I had burned dinner, just slightly charred the bottom of the rice, and Eduardo's reaction was so violent it left me shaking. He threw the entire pot across the kitchen and screamed that I was useless, that he had married a stupid girl who couldn't even handle simple tasks. The neighbors must have heard him, but no one came to check on us. In our community, what happened between a husband and wife was private business. At first it was just words. Constant criticism about everything I did wrong. I cooked too much salt or not enough. I cleaned the house in the wrong order. I spoke when I should have stayed quiet, or I was too quiet when he wanted conversation. Nothing I did pleased him, and he made sure I understood that my failures were personal defects that embarrassed him in front of others. The first time he hit me was on a Thursday morning in June. I had forgotten to iron his shirt the way he preferred, and when he raised his hand I actually felt surprised. The slap wasn't particularly hard, but it shocked me more than it hurt. I stood there touching my cheek, staring at him, and he looked almost as stunned as I felt. Then he told me it was my fault for not paying attention to his needs. I ran home to my parents that same afternoon, crying and showing my mother the red mark on my face. I expected comfort, maybe even outrage on my behalf. Instead, my mother sat me down and explained that marriage required adjustments for everyone. She said Eduardo was probably just frustrated because I was still learning how to be a proper wife. My father was more direct. He told me that my place was with my husband, and that running home whenever we had problems would only make things worse. They sent me back that evening with a basket of food and advice about being more attentive to Eduardo's moods. My mother said that once I gave him children, especially sons, he would settle down and become the husband I wanted him to be. She spoke about pregnancy like it was a cure for everything wrong in my marriage. Eduardo and I both wanted children, but for completely different reasons. I thought a baby might soften him, might give us something to love together and make our house feel less empty and hostile. He wanted sons to carry his name and work his land, to prove to the community that he was a successful man who could build a proper family. When I missed my monthly cycle 3 months after the wedding, we were both excited. Eduardo was gentler with me during those first weeks, more careful about his temper, and I allowed myself to hope that maybe my mother had been right. Maybe becoming parents would change everything between us. I spent those early months of pregnancy imagining the life we could build together, the family we could become. But even then, I noticed how Eduardo would place his hand on my belly and talk about his son. Never our baby or the child. Always his son, like he had already decided what I was carrying and what that child's purpose would be. Isabel arrived on a cold February morning after 14 hours of labor. The midwife placed her in my arms, this perfect little person with tiny fingers and the softest skin I had ever touched. I fell in love with her immediately, completely, in a way that surprised me with its intensity. But when Eduardo walked into the room and saw that the baby was a girl, his face changed. The excitement drained away, replaced by something that looked almost like disgust. He didn't hold Isabel that first day. He barely looked at her. Instead, he stood by the window smoking and complaining to anyone who would listen about his bad luck. My mother tried to comfort him by saying that girls often came first, that the next baby would surely be a boy. She spoke about my daughter like Isabel was a practice round, a mistake we would correct with the next pregnancy. I named her Isabel because it meant devoted to God, and I hoped that maybe divine protection would make up for her father's rejection. Eduardo wanted to try for another baby immediately, but the doctor said I needed time to recover. Those months with just Isabel were the happiest I had been since my wedding. She was a calm baby who rarely cried, and I could spend hours just watching her sleep or listening to her make soft sounds. But Eduardo's disappointment turned into resentment that poisoned everything in our house. He would come home from work angry about things that had nothing to do with us, and he would take that anger out on me. He said I had embarrassed him in front of the other men, that they were all wondering what was wrong with his wife, that she couldn't produce sons. When Isabel cried at night, he would shout about how useless daughters were, how they would never contribute anything valuable to the family. Rosa was born 18 months later, another daughter with dark hair like her sister and the same gentle temperament. This time, Eduardo didn't even pretend to be pleased. He walked out of the house when the midwife announced it was another girl and didn't come back for 3 days. When he returned, he was drunk and furious. He said I was defective, that something was wrong with my body that kept producing worthless children. My parents visited a week after Rosa's birth, and instead of congratulating me or admiring their new granddaughter, they spent the entire visit discussing what I needed to do differently next time. My mother brought herbs that she said would help me conceive sons, and my father lectured me about my obligations to my husband. They acted like I had failed some important test, like my 2 healthy daughters were evidence of personal weakness rather than blessings. The abuse got worse after Rosa arrived. Eduardo would blame me for everything that went wrong in his life, from bad weather affecting his crops to minor disputes with neighbors. He said that men with sons were respected in the community, but men with only daughters were pitted or mocked. He made me feel responsible for his reputation, for his happiness, for problems that existed long before I ever met him. I tried to protect my girls from seeing their father's anger, but children notice everything. Isabel, barely 2 years old, would flinch when Eduardo raised his voice. Rosa would cry harder whenever he was in the room. I realized that my daughters were learning to fear their own father, and that knowledge broke something inside me that I didn't know how to fix. The pressure to have another baby became constant. Eduardo would remind me daily that I owed him a son. My parents would ask during every visit when I planned to get pregnant again. Even women in the community would offer unsolicited advice about positions or prayers or foods that might help me produce male children. Everyone treated my body like it belonged to them, like my only purpose was to keep trying until I got it right. Elena came 2 years after Rosa, during a summer so hot that I spent most of my pregnancy feeling sick and dizzy. By then, I had stopped hoping that Eduardo would be happy about any baby I gave him unless it was a boy. When the midwife announced another daughter, Eduardo didn't even stay to see her. He left the house and spent the next week at his brother's place, drinking and complaining to anyone who would listen about his cursed wife. Elena was different from her sisters, more stubborn, louder, quicker to anger when she didn't get what she wanted. Eduardo said this proved that girls were nothing but trouble, that they would grow up to be difficult women who caused problems for their husbands. I loved Elena's fierce spirit, but I also worried about how that strength would serve her in a world that wanted women to be quiet and compliant. Taking care of 3 small children while Eduardo grew more hostile was like trying to hold water in my hands. Isabel was barely 4, Rosa was 2, and Elena needed constant attention. I was tired all the time, running on maybe 3 hours of sleep each night, always behind on the cooking and cleaning that Eduardo expected to be perfect. When I made mistakes, and I made many mistakes, he would explode with a fury that seemed too large for whatever had triggered it. The beatings became regular after Elena was born. Not every day, but often enough that I started watching Eduardo's moods carefully, trying to predict when his anger would turn physical. I learned to read the signs, the way his jaw tightened when he was looking for reasons to be upset, how his hands would clench into fists when he had been drinking, the particular tone his voice took right before he lost control completely. My parents visited less frequently, and when they did come, they spent most of their time asking when I would try again for a son. My mother would look at my 3 daughters like they were evidence of some failure on my part, some weakness in my character that prevented me from giving Eduardo what he deserved. She stopped bringing gifts for the girls and instead brought more herbs and folk remedies that were supposed to help me conceive male children. Lucia arrived when I was 22, after a labor that lasted almost 24 hours and left me weaker than I had ever felt in my life. 4 daughters now, 4 beautiful little girls who deserved better than the cold reception they received from their father and grandparents. Eduardo didn't speak to me for 2 weeks after Lucia's birth. He would come home from work, eat the dinner I prepared in silence, and then leave again without acknowledging that his newest daughter existed. By then, I was broken in ways I hadn't known were possible. Not just physically tired, though caring for 4 children under the age of 5 while dealing with Eduardo's violence was exhausting beyond description. I was emotionally hollow, like someone had reached inside me and scooped out all the hope and joy I had once carried. I moved through each day like I was sleepwalking, focused only on keeping my daughters fed and safe and trying to avoid Eduardo's anger. The community had opinions about my string of daughters. Women would whisper when I walked past with my girls, speculating about what I was doing wrong or what sins I might have committed to deserve such bad luck. Men would make jokes about Eduardo's inability to father sons, which only made him more violent at home. I felt like everyone was watching me, waiting to see if I would finally succeed at the one thing that mattered in their eyes. I started having dreams about running away, taking my girls and disappearing somewhere Eduardo and my parents couldn't find us. But I had no money, no skills that could support 5 people, no family who would help me leave my husband. Women in our community didn't get divorced, didn't live independently, didn't make choices about their own lives. I felt trapped in a situation that would only end when I died or when I finally gave Eduardo the son he demanded. My body felt like it belonged to everyone except me. Eduardo would force himself on me whenever he decided it was time to try for another baby, regardless of whether I was ready or willing. My parents would comment on my weight, my appearance, my fertility like these things were public property. Even strangers felt entitled to ask personal questions about my pregnancies and offer advice about how to conceive sons. I had become nothing more than a vessel for other people's expectations and disappointments. Anna was my father's sister, 10 years older than him and completely different from every other woman in our family. She had married young like the rest of us, but when her husband died in a farming accident after only 3 years, she made a choice that scandalized everyone. She refused to remarry. She kept his small house, learned to manage his debts, and built a life for herself that didn't depend on any man's approval. My parents rarely talked about Anna, and when they did, it was with the kind of disapproval reserved for people who had broken important rules. They said she was selfish for not giving her dead husband children, stubborn for refusing the marriage proposals that came after his death, unnatural for wanting to live alone. But I had always been curious about this aunt who seemed to operate by different laws than the rest of us. Anna started visiting me after Lucia was born. She would appear at my door on weekday afternoons when Eduardo was working, carrying small gifts for my daughters and staying just long enough to drink coffee and watch me try to manage 4 children at once. At first, I thought she was just being kind, but I gradually realized she was studying my situation with the careful attention of someone who recognized danger. She never asked directly about the bruises that sometimes marked my arms or the way I flinched when anyone moved too quickly. But she would make casual comments about how tired I looked, how thin I had gotten, how quiet I seemed compared to the girl she remembered from family gatherings. Anna had a way of saying things without saying them, of communicating concern through questions that sounded innocent but felt loaded with meaning. One afternoon when Isabel was helping her younger sisters play with wooden blocks, Anna sat beside me at the kitchen table and said something that stopped my heart. She said I reminded her of a bird she had once seen with a broken wing, still alive but unable to fly, just sitting in a cage waiting for someone to decide its fate. She said the saddest part wasn't that the bird was trapped, but that it had forgotten it was supposed to be free. I started crying then, quietly so my daughters wouldn't notice, and Anna reached across the table to touch my hand. She said she knew I was in pain, that she had watched Eduardo's behavior at family events and seen how my parents treated my situation like it was normal and acceptable. She said I was stronger than the circumstances that were crushing me, but that I would need to remember that strength if I ever wanted things to change. Anna began teaching me things my parents never thought I needed to know. She showed me how to keep track of money, how to save small amounts without anyone noticing, how to plan and organize in ways that could prepare me for possibilities I wasn't ready to name yet. She brought me books, real books, not just the religious texts Eduardo allowed in the house, and helped me improve my reading skills during those quiet afternoon visits. She never told me to leave Eduardo. She never criticized my parents directly or suggested that I was making wrong choices. Instead, she planted ideas in my mind like seeds, small thoughts that grew larger over time. She would mention women in other towns who had found ways to support themselves after difficult marriages ended. She would talk about skills that could help someone start over in a new place. She would describe independence like it was something real and achievable rather than a fantasy. Most importantly, Anna helped me remember who I had been before Eduardo, before marriage, before the weight of everyone else's expectations made me forget my own voice. She reminded me that I had once loved books and learning, that I had dreamed of teaching children, that I had possessed curiosity and ambition that belonged to me alone. She made me realize that those parts of myself hadn't died. They were just buried under years of being told they didn't matter. Anna's visits became the highlight of my weeks. For an hour or two I could talk to someone who saw me as more than just a failed wife and disappointed daughter. She treated my thoughts and opinions like they had value, listened to my concerns about my daughter's futures, and spoke to me like I was a person worthy of respect and consideration. Those conversations reminded me that I deserved better than what I was receiving, even when I wasn't yet brave enough to do anything about it. When I found out I was pregnant for the 5th time, Eduardo was convinced this baby would be different. He watched me constantly, making sure I ate the right foods and did everything the old women said would help produce a son. My parents visited more often, bringing gifts and acting like this pregnancy mattered more than my previous ones. Mateo was born on a rainy morning in October 1963. When the midwife announced he was a boy, Eduardo wept with joy. My parents embraced like they had won a contest. The whole village celebrated for days, with men clapping Eduardo on the back and calling him blessed. But when they placed Mateo in my arms, I felt something unexpected. Not relief or triumph, just overwhelming love for this tiny person who had no idea what burden everyone was placing on him. He was perfect, no more or less valuable than Isabel, Rosa, Elena, or Lucia. For a few weeks, I hoped maybe everyone had been right. Maybe having a son would change Eduardo, make him gentler. He did seem different at first, more attentive, less angry. But it didn't last. Within a month he was back to criticizing everything I did, only now he had new complaints about how I was raising his precious son. Worse, Eduardo began treating my daughters differently. He would comment about how much easier boys were, how much more potential Mateo had. Isabel was 7 and smart enough to understand that her father saw her baby brother as more important than she would ever be. The abuse didn't stop. If anything, it got worse because now Eduardo had something precious to protect, and he blamed me for anything that might threaten Mateo's well-being. If the baby cried, it was my fault. If he seemed sick, I was a bad mother. Holding Mateo during those quiet night feedings, I realized nothing had actually changed. Eduardo was still the same man who had been hurting me for 8 years. Having a son hadn't fixed any of the real problems. It had just given everyone a reason to pretend those problems didn't exist. Isabel turned 8 the month after Mateo was born, and she had started asking questions that made Eduardo angry. Why did she have to help with cooking when her baby brother didn't? Why couldn't she go to school longer like the boys? These were reasonable questions from a smart child, but Eduardo saw them as defiance. The first time he raised his hand to Isabel, I stepped between them without thinking. He had been yelling at her for dropping a plate, and when she started crying, his anger escalated. Isabel cowered against the kitchen wall, and I saw my own fear reflected in her 8-year-old eyes. That's when I knew I couldn't let my daughters grow up the way I had. I started watching my girls more carefully after that. Rosa had learned to make herself invisible when her father was angry. Elena would freeze whenever Eduardo raised his voice. Even little Lucia would run to hide behind my skirt when he came home from work. My daughters were learning to live in fear just like me. Anna visited the next week and I told her what had happened with Isabel. Instead of giving me advice about managing Eduardo's temper, she asked me a question that changed everything. She asked if I thought my girls deserved the same life I was living. The answer was so clear it took my breath away. No. My daughters deserve to feel safe in their own home. They deserve to chase their dreams without fearing violence. They deserve to grow up believing they were valuable, not because of what they could provide for men but because they were human beings. Anna and I began meeting more frequently, always when Eduardo was working. She helped me think through possibilities I had never considered before. What would I need to survive on my own with 5 children? Where could we go where Eduardo wouldn't find us? Anna helped me open a small account at the bank in the next town. I started saving every coin I could, hide money from selling eggs, small amounts I could skim from the household budget. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it represented the first steps toward a future I was finally brave enough to imagine. The opportunity came on a Thursday morning in March when Eduardo left early to help his brother move cattle to a different pasture. He would be gone all day, maybe into the evening. I had been planning for weeks, but suddenly having the actual chance made my hands shake so badly I could barely pack our few belongings. I told the children we were visiting Aunt Anna for a few days, nothing more. Isabel helped me dress Rosa and Elena while I fed Mateo and tried to act normal. But Isabel was 8 and smart. She kept asking why I was packing so many clothes for just a short visit, why I looked so nervous, why we had to leave so quickly. Anna was waiting for us at the edge of town with her old truck. She had saved more money than I knew existed. Money she pressed into my hands along with the address of a boarding house 3 towns over where she said the owner was a widow who understood difficult situations. The bus station was only 20 minutes away, but those were the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept looking over my shoulder, certain I would see Eduardo's truck coming after us. Every sound made me jump. Lucia started crying because she could feel my fear, and I had to keep reassuring all my children that everything was fine while my heart pounded so hard I thought it might stop completely. The boarding house was small and clean with thin walls and shared bathrooms, but it felt like a palace because Eduardo didn't know where it was. The widow, Mrs. Santos, asked no questions about why a woman with 5 young children had appeared at her door with 1 suitcase and terrified eyes. She just showed us to a room with 2 beds and told me the weekly rate. Anna visited 3 days later with more clothes for the children and news about work. She had spoken to a woman who ran a small clothing shop and needed someone who could sew quickly and carefully. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to cover our room and food if I was careful with every penny. Those first weeks were the hardest and most liberating of my life. I was exhausted from working all day and then caring for 5 children in one small room at night. Matteo was still nursing, and the older girls were confused about why we weren't going home to Papa. But every morning when I woke up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 9 years: safety. I learned to sew faster than I thought possible, taking on extra work whenever it was available. My fingers bled from the needle pricks, and my back ached from hunching over the machine for 12 hours a day, but the money I earned belonged to me. No one could take it away or tell me how to spend it. For the first time since my wedding, I was making decisions about my own life. The children adapted more quickly than I expected. Isabel started attending school regularly for the first time, and her teacher said she was remarkably bright for a child who had missed so much education. Rosa and Elena made friends with other children in the boarding house. Even Lucia seemed happier, laughing more often and sleeping better without the constant tension that had filled our old house. Eduardo searched for us, of course. Anna told me later that he had gone to my parents' house first, then driven through every neighboring town asking if anyone had seen a woman with 5 children. But we had disappeared completely, and after a few months she said he seemed to give up and accept that we were gone for good. After 6 months in the boarding house, I had saved enough to rent a small apartment with 2 bedrooms and our own kitchen. Standing in that empty living room with my 5 children, I realized that for the first time in my adult life I was choosing where we would live. The work was hard but steady. Mrs. Rodriguez appreciated that I showed up every day on time, and she started giving me more complicated pieces that paid better. Eventually she taught me alterations for customers. My skills improved quickly because I had to feed 5 children, and desperation made me learn fast. Isabel flourished in her new school. Her teacher said she was reading far beyond her age and had a natural talent for mathematics. Those evening study sessions at our kitchen table reminded me how much I had once loved learning. I started borrowing books from the library, reading after the children slept, slowly expanding my world beyond just survival. My parents found us after about a year. They came to convince me to return to Eduardo, bringing messages about how sorry he was. They said I was being selfish, depriving my children of their father. But sitting in my apartment watching Isabel help Rosa with homework while Elena played with Lucia and Matteo crawled around exploring, I saw what they couldn't. My children were thriving. I told my parents I wouldn't go back and asked them to stop bringing Eduardo's messages. They left angry, warning me I'd regret my stubbornness. That was our last conversation for many years. The community around us became family. Mrs. Santos watched the children when I worked late. Miss Carmen tutored Isabel for free. Mrs. Rodriguez let me bring baby Matteo to work when I needed to. These women understood building a life without depending on men. I taught my children things I'd never been allowed to learn. How to manage money, read contracts, stand up for themselves. I told my girls they could choose their own husbands when grown or not marry at all. I taught Matteo that his sisters were as smart as he was, that being a man meant protecting women, not controlling them. By our 3rd year, I was managing alterations at the shop and earning enough to rent a larger apartment. For the first time since I was 16, I was choosing my own life. Now, at 85, I sit surrounded by the family I chose to create instead of the one I was forced to accept. Isabel became the teacher she dreamed of being, spending 30 years helping children learn. She married a gentleman and raised 2 daughters who both became doctors. Rosa became a nurse, working in emergency rooms for decades. She never married by choice and traveled to places I could never have imagined. Elena surprised everyone by becoming a mechanic with her own shop, married to a partner who treated her as an equal. Lucia became a lawyer, fighting for other women trapped like I had been. Matteo grew up to be the kind of man I hoped he could become. He learned from his sisters that women were capable of anything. He treats his wife as a partner worth listening to, not property to be managed. My 15 grandchildren visit regularly, from college students to toddlers who climb on my lap for stories. My granddaughters expect to go to college, choose their careers, marry for love or not at all. They argue about curfews and clothes, typical battles that represent freedoms I never had. People ask if I regret leaving Eduardo. The answer is simple. I regret the years I wasted believing I had no choices. But I never regretted leaving because that decision gave all of us the chance to become who we were meant to be. The hardest part about telling this story is knowing women are still living versions of my old life. Still being told their dreams don't matter, still accepting violence, still staying because leaving seems impossible. I want them to know what I learned. You are enough exactly as you are. You don't need permission to choose your path. I'm not just a survivor. I'm a woman who discovered her strength, who raised 5 children to believe in themselves, who built a life based on love instead of fear. At 85, the best decision I ever made was the scariest one, choosing to save myself and my children by walking away and starting over. That choice changed everything, not just for me but for generations who will never have to live the way I lived. I'm so grateful you've listened to my story this far. It's not always easy revisiting these memories, but knowing that sharing them might help someone else find their way makes it completely worthwhile. I truly hope that what I've shared today isn't just a sad tale, but also a source of motivation. It's a reminder that no matter how difficult life becomes, there's always light at the end of the road. Always remember that strength lies within you, and hope is a flame that should never be put out. To help us keep spreading these meaningful stories, please support the Grandparents Archives channel by subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with your loved ones. I want to sincerely thank the founder of Grandparents Archives for giving me this opportunity to share my experience. Stay tuned for more touching stories on the Grandparents Archives channel.